Alrighty, it is 2024 and we are here today talking about the best beginner Canon cameras for you to buy. So this list may or may not ruffle some feathers, but without further ado, let's dive into today's video. All right, so the first camera up on this list is the Canon T7. This can be found for about $479 brand new and can be found a lot cheaper used and can be sometimes found on sale brand new as well. Now, this may ruffle some feathers. We're starting off with a big one because this camera is old. And I get it. It is very old. I personally started about 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, right? Goodness me, I should know that. I got it 9 years ago, right? I started 9 years ago with the Canon T6. So why am I recommending the Canon T7? Well, in my opinion, and from nearly anyone else that I've spoken to in this industry, this camera is more than enough to get started if you're taking photos. If you're shooting video, don't look at this camera. But if you're shooting photos, this is enough for you to learn and understand shutter speed, aperture, ISO, white balance, autofocus settings, drive modes, you name it. This camera is going to teach you everything you need to know. It's also cheap, so you're not investing in something that you may or may not love in the future. And the best part is the lenses are super affordable. The next two cameras on this list are a little bit more expensive, to be honest with you. And they use the Canon RF glass, which is renowned to be extremely expensive, and it is. But this uses the Canon EF mount, which is a lot cheaper, especially if you're buying used. So keep that in mind. But with that said, let's dive into the specs. So we are rocking a 24 megapixel sensor. We're rocking 9 AF points, and while that doesn't sound like a lot, especially in comparison to the cameras coming up, it's more than enough to get you by. You know, you're not going to be shooting f1, but you can shoot a lot of stuff with 9 AF points, okay? It's got an APS-C size sensor, and so does the next camera, but this camera has an APS-C size sensor, which means that it's not full frame. So if you're looking at using a 100mm lens, you've got to times that lens by 1.6 to get the focal length that you're actually going to be using. So a 100mm lens on a full frame body would be 100mm, but a 100mm lens on an APS-C size body is going to be 160mm. So you get a lot more range. That can be a good and a bad thing depending on what you're shooting, but this camera, the T7, has an APS-C size sensor. It is an EF mount, so like I touched on, the lenses are way cheaper, especially because they're not getting made anymore. Canon is focusing on the RF mount glass, so everyone moving to the RF mount glass are selling all their EF glass. Prices are crashing, which is great. It's 1080p capped video, so you won't be shooting 4K, and the video is average at best, okay? Like I said, you wouldn't be touching this camera if you're shooting video, believe me. This is photography only. Please understand that. And something absolutely worth noting is there is a reason why you can still buy these brand new, is because they are really solid beginner cameras. You can go to B&H Photo right now, pick up one of these, and you're sorted, right? You can go to a lot of camera stores and buy these brand new, which is mind-blowing. It's old, I get it. I totally understand. And a lot of people usually flame me for talking about such old, cheaper camera bodies, but there's a reason why they're so solid. So keep this in mind if you're a beginner. This is the absolute entry-level body, okay, that I would recommend. I wouldn't recommend anything lower. If you're serious, somewhat serious about photography and getting into it, the Canon T7 is where it's at. Okay, moving on to camera number 2. Now, like I said, the next two cameras, this one and the next one, are going to be a lot more modern. And this is going to be the Canon R10. These are usually found for about $980 brand new and can be found for about $850, $890, that kind of range on sale. You can also buy these secondhand, but you're not going to be making that much of a difference. Maybe a couple $100 maximum, if any. So this camera also is rocking an APS-C size sensor. So when we're talking about lenses here, you've got to remember things are a little bit tighter. And speaking of sensors, this guy is rocking a 24 megapixel sensor. My girlfriend actually has one of these cameras. I recommended it to her. She loves it. I think it's great. And moving on to autofocus points, we are talking about 651 autofocus points in the Canon R10. One of the things, the main differences between the T7 and the Canon R10 is that they are made in completely different generations, if you will. The T7 still has a mirror. It's not a mirrorless camera. The R10 is mirrorless. So it's leaps and miles ahead in technology than the T7 is, but at the end of the day, they're still going to be taking considerably similar photos. So keep that in mind. If you don't need all the tech and flashy stuff, maybe the T7 is for you. But if you want brand new and the best of the best in this kind of category, then the R10 is a great choice. Like I said, we're rocking an APS-C size sensor here. It's also super small and it's a tiny body. So if you don't want to be hiking huge gear around, the R10 is a great shout. It does have the RF mount though, so do keep this in mind. Also keep this in mind as well. You can mount EF glass on an RF body, but you do have to buy about a $160 adapter that sits in between, and it's about that big. So it does add size and weight to your camera. If you don't mind, by all means, go for it, but this has an RF mount on it. 4K video is actually not too bad on this, to be fair with you. It shoots 4K, 10-bit, 422 video, which is incredible. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you whatsoever, it probably doesn't matter to you. But if you are looking at shooting video, a little bit more of a hybrid camera, this is a great choice. However, it doesn't have in-body image stabilization. So something that a lot of mirrorless cameras do rock is sensor shift stabilization, which is incredible. It pretty much means as your hand jitters and shakes as you're shooting video, it's moving the sensor to compensate for that, which is crazy. Unfortunately, the Canon R10 does not have this, nor does the T7, and nor does the camera that I'm about to recommend next. So keep this in mind. If you're a video shooter, maybe you're gonna need to buy lenses that have image stabilization built in. At this price point, the Canon R10 is hard to beat, to be honest with you. It's super impressive for what you get, and especially in such a small, compact body. Okay, and last but not least, before I recommend just a handful of lenses, we have the Canon R8. These are usually found for about $14.99, but can be found on sale for about $12.99, which is really cool. And this is the only camera on this list with a full frame sensor. So whatever millimeter your lens is, that's what you get. What it says on the tin is what you get. So a 20 millimeter lens is going to be 20 millimeters. You don't need to multiply it here. You're rocking a 24 megapixel sensor. And while it's the same megapixel count as the Canon R10, you're going to be getting a completely different look to your shots. A full frame sensor is physically bigger. It's a 35 millimeter sensor, which means you're going to be letting in more light. So it's going to do better in low light. And it's also going to give you a lot more of a nicer, blurrier background in your shots, which is a very sought after look in photography. Let's move on to autofocus points. This one is actually quite cool. It's got 4,897 autofocus points covering the entire sensor, which is wild. It's insane. I don't think you need that many autofocus points to notice a huge difference. So between the Canon R8 and the Canon R10, it's probably not miles apart, not like the Canon T7 and the Canon R10. So keep this in mind. It's got a load of autofocus points. You can shoot 4K 60 FPS C-Log3 422 10-bit footage, which is really, really cool, especially for this price point. To shoot 10-bit 422 C-Log3 footage, you at least needed to be on the R6 or the R5 a couple of years ago. Now the R8's out, it makes it a very, very cool choice. And mentioning the Canon R6, this is a very similar camera to the Canon R6 and the Canon R6 Mark II. It's a slightly smaller body, but it doesn't have image stabilization. So this is a little bit of a downside like I was talking about with the R10. The R8 also doesn't have image stabilization, so something to really keep in mind. It is an RF mount camera, so also keep that in mind as well. You will be spending a pretty penny on your lenses. And overall, this is a really strong photo and video hybrid body for a lot of shooters. If you're starting out with this camera, you won't need to upgrade for quite a long time. And this is probably the best starting camera if you're serious and you know you're serious about photo and video. I'd begin here. All right, so that pretty much wraps up the list of the best Canon cameras that you could start with in 2024. And just as a little bonus, a little thank you for making it this far in the video, I just want to run through a few lens options that are really good for the following cameras. So with the T7 and the Canon R10, you'll be able to use APS-C lenses, and with the R8, you'll only be able to use full frame lenses, which are also a little bit more expensive. So let's start with the APS-C lenses. First up on the chopping block is the 10 to 18 millimeter. On the T7, this will fit. On the Canon R10, you will need the RF to EF mount adapter, the adapter that adds a little bit of weight and is about that big. This is going to be a really versatile zoom lens, and it roughly gets you to that 16 to 35 millimeter range, which is perfect. It's also very affordable. And talking about affordable, one of my favorite beginner, and to be honest, even I use this lens all the time, is the Canon RF or EF 50mm f1.8. This is going to get you to about a 75-80 millimeter focal length, which is more than fine. It's quite tight, but that f1.8 aperture at this price point, we're talking $100 to $200 depending on what mount you get, is incredibly useful and versatile. I'd really suggest picking up one of these if you're just getting into the world of photography or videography, as it's going to open up your world like no tomorrow. All right, then moving on to some lenses for the Canon R8. I would definitely recommend the 50mm f1.8, so that's gonna stay on the list. And then we've got two other really strong choices. The first one is the 24 to 105 f4 to f7.1. Now, I get it. I don't really recommend ever getting a variable aperture lens I just don't like them. But the sharpness out of this lens is something else. Look, if you can afford the 24-105 f4, go for it. Love that lens. I used to have that lens when I first started, the EF mount version of it, and it looks amazing on a full frame camera. It's got image stabilization, which is great. All of them have image stabilization in them. So this is something that you should definitely consider. And if you do have a little bit more cash to splash, because keep in mind, you always want to make sure you're spending more on your lens than you are on your camera body. If you do have a little bit more cash to splash, the 24-70 f2.8 IS is gorgeous. You do want to be focusing on a lens that has image stabilization, hopefully, if you can afford it. And the 24-70 2.8 IS is without a doubt the best lens that you would be able to get as a versatile, do-it-all zoom lens. It's definitely not a beginner lens, don't get me wrong. The optics of this lens are stunning. So if you can justify it, go for it. If not, the 24-105 is more than enough. All right, guys, so that is gonna wrap up today's video. I hope you've enjoyed. If you're new around here, a subscribe would mean the world. And just before we do end things, I wanna ask you a little bit of a favor. If you are getting into beginner photography, I do have a beginner's guide to consistently taking good photos course linked down below. I built this course about 6 months ago. I absolutely love it. A lot of other people love it. It's helped a load of people, and I'd love it if it could help you out as well. So if you could do me a favor and go check that out down below, that'd mean the world. And guys, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.